In 1989, when European aviation was still a fragmented collection of national flag carriers protected by government subsidies and bilateral treaties, KLM Royal Dutch Airlines attempted something no European airline had ever done. It formed a deep transatlantic joint venture with Northwest Airlines, pooling revenues, coordinating schedules, and sharing profits across the Atlantic Ocean. KLM was staking its future on an American partner rather than building a fortress hub to rival London Heathrow or Frankfurt. The Dutch carrier had a compact home base at Amsterdam Schiphol and a network that reached every continent despite the Netherlands having a population of barely 16 million. One miscalculation in the partnership meant irreverence in an industry consolidating around giants. For decades since, European aviation has accepted a painful truth. Small flag carriers cannot survive alone. They get absorbed, stripped down, and folded into larger groups. The brand disappears, the identity dissolves, independence always loses. Then, on May 5, 2004, Air France acquired KLM for approximately €784 million, creating one of the world's largest airline groups. Headlines across Europe declared it a French takeover. The Dutch carrier, everyone assumed, would be swallowed whole within a decade. 21 years later, KLM still operates its own fleet. KLM still holds its own air operator certificate. KLM still orders its own aircraft, including new Airbus A350s arriving from 2026. KLM still runs Schiphol as an independent hub. KLM's headquarters remain in Amsterdam, not Paris. Yet, Air France-KLM just posted €1.7 billion in annual profit, €33 billion in revenue, and is now acquiring a majority stake in SAS to build a three-hub empire across Western and Northern Europe. To understand why KLM's survival is extraordinary, we need to understand why airline mergers almost always result in the acquired carrier losing its identity. The economics are brutal. Aviation operates on thin margins, typically between 3 and 8%. Separate fleets prevent bulk purchasing discounts. Independent operations mean duplicate IT systems, duplicate training programs, duplicate maintenance facilities. Every redundancy erodes the cost synergies that justified the merger in the first place. British Airways and Iberia merged to form IAG in 2011. While both airlines retained separate brands, back-end operations increasingly centralized under the group's control. Fleet decisions and capital allocation flowed through a single corporate structure. KLM should have followed the same trajectory. Paris, not Amsterdam, would house the group headquarters. Every structural indicator pointed toward French dominance, and yet that's not what happened. Then, in September 2003, when the merger was first announced, something unusual occurred behind closed doors that most of the industry missed entirely. KLM's negotiating team, backed by the Dutch government, secured a set of structural protections that had no precedent in aviation mergers. These weren't vague promises or handshake agreements, they were legally binding mechanisms embedded in the corporate architecture itself. First, KLM retained its own air operator certificate. This sounds technical, but it's everything. An AOC is the legal document that permits an airline to operate. Without a separate AOC, KLM's bilateral traffic rights, the government-to-government agreements that allowed Dutch aircraft to land in countries like Japan, China, and India, would have been void. A French-controlled KLM would have lost access to dozens of international routes overnight. Second, KLM negotiated fleet autonomy. The airline would continue making independent decisions about which aircraft to order, when to order them, and how to configure them. This prevented Air France from standardizing the combined fleet around its own preferences. Third, and most critically, KLM established two Dutch foundations known as stichtings. Foundation SAC 1 held voting rights for shares transferred during the merger. Foundation SAC 2 held what are called preference shares B, with a call option to acquire additional voting shares. If Air France ever attempted to strip KLM of its independence, or if the French government interfered too aggressively, these foundations could dilute Air France-KLM's voting power in KLM to below 50% for a period of 2 years. In plain terms, KLM built a poison pill into the merger agreement. The acquiring company could own KLM on paper, but it could never fully control KLM in practice. The European Commission approved the merger in February 2004, requiring the surrender of 94 takeoff and landing slots at Paris and Amsterdam to preserve competition. But nobody in Brussels questioned the Dutch foundation structure. It was treated as a regulatory formality. It was, in fact, the single most consequential negotiating victory in modern European aviation. But before the full significance of these protections became clear, KLM proved something else entirely, something that reversed the power dynamic within the group. For most of the decade following the merger, KLM was consistently more profitable than Air France. Not marginally more profitable, dramatically more profitable. KLM's operating margin hovered around 5 to 6%, while Air France struggled with repeated strikes, management turmoil, and chronic cost overruns. You see, Air France's problems were structural. A heavily unionized workforce resisted restructuring. 3 separate CEOs came and went between 2016 and 2018 alone. The airline's cost-based seat was significantly higher than KLM's, eroding margins on every route they competed on. Meanwhile, KLM operated with a lean culture, inherited from decades of competing against carriers 5 times its size. This created a paradox the group leadership couldn't resolve. The acquired airline was subsidizing the acquirer. KLM staff began to view themselves, with justification, as the cash cow propping up a dysfunctional parent. Dutch management argued, correctly, that any forced integration would destroy the only reliable profit engine the group had. And this is where the structural protections proved their real value, not as theoretical safeguards, but as actual leverage. When Group CEO Ben Smith arrived in 2018, appointed from Air Canada, he attempted to centralize operations and remove KLM's independence. The threat of strikes at KLM, normally the stable, predictable partner, forced Smith to reverse course. The friction was real, but the friction was also the point. But here's where this entire story takes a big, unexpected turn. The significance of KLM's merger protections isn't just about preserving Dutch pride, and it isn't really about a different shade of blue on the aircraft. It's about what one set of legal mechanisms can do to an entire industry's assumptions about how consolidation works. In February 2019, as tensions between Paris and Amsterdam escalated over Ben Smith's centralization agenda, Dutch Finance Minister Wopke Hoekstra executed what French officials would later describe as an act of corporate raiding by a sovereign government. Overnight, without informing Paris, without consulting the Air France-KLM board, and without seeking parliamentary approval, the Dutch government purchased 12.68% of Air France-KLM shares on the open market for €680 million. He later increased the stake to 14%, matching the French government's holding almost exactly. Bruno Le Maire, France's economy minister, was furious. He called it an unfriendly and surprising move. The comparison to a hostile corporate raider wasn't diplomatic language, it was genuine shock. The Dutch government had effectively created a political stalemate at the ownership level. France held 28% through various instruments. The Netherlands now held 14%, plus the dormant poison pill foundations. Any attempt to dissolve KLM's independence would trigger a multi-front battle involving 2 European governments, 2 sets of labor unions, and a legal structure designed specifically to prevent exactly that outcome. The Netherlands Court of Audit later ruled the purchase procedurally irregular because it bypassed Parliament, but the stake was already acquired, the leverage was already secured. Consider the mathematics of this maneuver. KLM negotiated its independence in 2004 with legal protections. KLM proved its financial superiority throughout the 2010s with consistent profitability, and the Dutch government locked the entire agreement in place in 2019 with €680 million spent in a single night. No other acquired airline in history has a sovereign government acting as its personal bodyguard inside the acquiring company's shareholder register. Most airline groups cannot replicate what KLM achieved because the conditions that enabled it were unique. KLM's historical profitability gave it credibility to resist integration, and the Netherlands' economic dependence on Schiphol gave the government existential motivation to intervene. Yet, every airline group must now account for what KLM demonstrated. The assumption that acquisition means absorption is no longer absolute. Air France-KLM itself appears to have learned the lesson. In 2024, the group completed its initial acquisition of roughly 20% of SAS, the Scandinavian carrier, with plans to increase to 60.5% by 2026. SAS has already switched from Star Alliance to SkyTeam, feeding traffic into both Amsterdam and Paris. The strategy creates a three-hub network spanning Paris, Amsterdam, and Copenhagen that encircles Lufthansa's Central European dominance. But the SAS acquisition is being structured with echoes of the KLM model: separate brand preservation, operational autonomy, a recognition that forcing Scandinavian identity into a French corporate mold would provoke exactly the kind of political and labor resistance that nearly tore the Franco-Dutch partnership apart. Lufthansa's centralized approach, fully absorbing Swiss, Austrian, and Brussels airlines, generates cost efficiency. IAG's financial holding structure generates operational flexibility. But Air France-KLM's federated model, born from KLM's insistence on independence, generates something neither competitor has achieved. It generates political resilience across multiple European nations simultaneously. When the pandemic struck in 2020, the Netherlands provided 3.4 billion euros specifically for KLM, while France provided 7 billion euros for Air France, two separate state aid packages for two separate airlines within one group. That structural separation saved both carriers from having to negotiate a single, politically impossible bailout across two governments. The group now generates 33 billion euros in annual revenue. Premium cabins account for over 36% of group revenues. Flying Blue, the shared loyalty program, celebrating its 20th anniversary, has grown to nearly 30 million members. 12 aircraft don't scale volume, they scale influence. But in KLM's case, one set of legal protections scaled the entire competitive architecture of European aviation consolidation. In 1989, KLM formed that transatlantic joint venture with Northwest Airlines because there was no alternative. A carrier from a nation of 16 million people couldn't build a global network alone. The partnership was survival, not strategy. 2 decades later, KLM's merger with Air France represented the complete opposite. Not a desperate concession to a larger power, but a deliberate architectural project to embed independence so deeply into a corporate structure that removing it would cost more than preserving it. When Air France-KLM posted that record 1.7 billion euros in net profit in 2025, when the group finalized its majority stake in SAS, when Air France pilots flew KLM Boeing 777s out of Amsterdam with KLM cabin crew on board, every one of those developments carried the fingerprints of a negotiation that happened in 2003. One set of legal mechanisms, two Dutch foundations, a separate AOC, fleet autonomy, and a government willing to spend 680 million euros in the middle of the night to make sure none of it disappeared. The result is a carrier that was acquired 21 years ago and still operates as if it wasn't, still ordering its own A350s, still running its own hub, still employing its own people under its own terms, still painting its aircraft in that unmistakable shade of blue. The question isn't whether KLM outsmarted Air France in one merger nobody understood. It's whether every other airline facing acquisition is really paying attention.